Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters, and welcome to this week's live chat. It's been a couple weeks since I've been on here. It's been a February, to say the least. I was sick 2 weeks ago, and then last week the power went out about an hour before the live chat. So it was just like, okay. But I'm glad to be here today talking about machine quilting. As always, Jessica's here behind the camera monitoring the chat, and if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments, and she will give those to me at the end, and I'll answer them. If you haven't joined me for live chat, about almost every Thursday, barring special circumstances, I get on here and talk about machine quilting and some facet of it. And we had just wrapped up a whole video series, and so I was like, oh, what am I going to talk about now? And Jessica had the great idea that maybe we could go back and revisit a previous free motion challenge. And I thought, you know what, let's work through the rulers. So the free motion challenge quilting alongs are just, a series of videos on a certain topic, and I've got, gosh, about 10 of them. And so the machine quilting with rulers one came out a couple years ago, but I thought it'd be fun to live chat today kind of about straight edge rulers and talk about using the reference lines, because it's one thing to know how to use your ruler, but how do you use those little markings on it? So it's going to be a good time. I'm looking forward to chatting about all that. So the machine quilting with rulers videos, I'm not going to obviously go through them all, but if you go to my YouTube channel, you can find those. And in the video series, I work through different types of rulers. I would go through straight edge, wavy, points, arcs, all that kind of stuff. And that's what we're going to kind of do for the next few weeks, kind of, live chat about that. And so in the video series, you can kind of see the different designs that we learned through that. Some of you might have already watched those. I hope you have. But the thing I love about machine quilting with rulers is it's that one skill that will grow with you on your machine quilting journey, whether you're a brand new machine quilter or one that's more established and just looking for design inspiration. Ruler work or quilting with rulers is really handy all the way through there. And I like to joke, there's not every ruler is for every quilter. That's definitely the case, but in the videos, I kind of give you design ideas for them. And so the first video in that series was machine quilting with straight edge rulers. Now, the reason I love straight edge rulers, it's the perfect place to start for brand new quilters because the point of contact on the foot of your machine is the same throughout the whole ruler. But it's also one of those versatile rulers. I use my straight edge ruler 99% of the time. And so you can do a lot with it, of course. And this is the case whether you're on a sewing machine or a long arm. So it's definitely going to help you out. But I love to use it for echoing, straight line echoing, like we can see in the lighter portions of this block. We know I love echoing because it's a great way to highlight pieces of a quilt pattern or a block, and it's a great way to draw attention to that area. And that straight edge ruler helps us keep those lines straight-ish. Now, in the video, I kind of talk about how, we're not aiming for perfection here, but it's definitely given us a template to kind of follow. And then diamond or diagonal lines of any length and stitching in the ditch. So you can kind of see around that purple triangle my stitching lines. Stitching in the ditch is something I like to do because I think it makes the quilt look better. It helps me move my way around the blocks. And so using a straight edge ruler helps me keep those lines pretty close to that seam. And then I also like to use it for diagonal lines of any length. So, whether I'm doing some back and forth lines or some, kind of diagonal lines of any angle, I guess I should say. Really nice and versatile. Of course, crosshatch. I kind of threw this picture in there because that's like the only picture of crosshatch quilting I have, which is diagonal lines that overlap. Definitely going to help you with those. And using the reference lines on your ruler helps you do that, which I'll show you or talk about here in a second. And of course, block motifs with those diagonal lines. On a long arm, I'm going to use a ruler for diagonal lines of any length. Now on a sewing machine, you might not need it for shorter lines or, even if you're moving more horizontal or vertical. The thing I love to say in my rulers classes is it's a tool, it's not a crutch. So use that ruler to help you make those designs, but it's definitely not something you have to use. And then even we can see here diagonal lines. So really just helping you get those straight-ish lines. Now in the video series, the Machine Quilting Free Motion Challenge, that first video I showed how to do the square spiral design. So you can check out that video if you want to learn this one. We saw echoing, of course, more of that straight line echoing, and then also a jumbled lines design. So this is a perfect design for bigger background areas where I want just a nice texture. So if you want to see the specifics about quilting those designs or how to quilt with rulers in general, you can check out that video series. And there's a link to it in the description box below, so you can check it out there as well. Before we get into the reference lines, just a quick little primer, like what do we look for in a straight edge ruler? If you have fallen down the rabbit hole of quilting rulers, you know there's like 1.5 million of each type of ruler. It can be overwhelming, all the options, but remember, not every ruler is for every quilter. So for instance, you might like a longer, bigger straight edge ruler if you have more throat space on your machine. You tend to do a lot of cross hatching or longer lines. But one thing I talk about in the video, and I'm not going to go into details here, but even if I'm using a longer ruler, I'm still only quilting between my fingertips. So longer rulers are great because they let me see where I've been, where I'm going, but I'm still going to have to move along that ruler as I quilt. So a nice big one is an option. I tend to use slim all the time, so I like slim because it's just hand-sized, but nice straight edge ruler. Again, you know, just depends on your preferences. You might want something smaller, so here's a smaller option. Maybe you have less throat space. The idea of quilting with rulers is a little scary to you. I mean, you can't be scared of shorty. It's just like no problem there, right? But sometimes you might get a ruler that has multiple functions and then has a straight edge as a part of it. This is a great option if you don't want to invest in a lot of rulers. You want some rulers that give you, a lot of bang for your buck. But, looking at just some straight edge, you might already have a ruler laying around that is maybe meant for something else, but has a straight edge that you can use. So it really kind of just depends on what you have on hand. If you're not sure which ruler to get, I like to joke that it's a pretty good idea to find a friend that has rulers, borrow theirs, and see which ones you like. But just kind of thinking through, what is it that you struggle with, and what is it that you like to do. So there's a lot of, again, things to look for in those straight edge rulers. The most important thing though is reference lines. Reference lines are key because they're going to help you keep your lines straight to each other in the block, even if that quilt isn't perfectly straight. So using those reference lines will really help you, not only quilt faster, but get those nice straight lines. Now, depending on the reference lines that your ruler comes with, it might have several, it might just have a few, but we're going to kind of talk through how to use those and why I would want to use those reference lines. I will say that sometimes reference lines might be hard to see. I love Creative Grids because they have the white and black dashed lines, so you can see the lines on any kind of fabric. But let's talk about using those reference lines. Again, if I'm using that straight edge ruler for echoing, I'm going to use those reference lines to keep those lines kind of straight. One thing I decided to do was kind of make step-by-step diagrams. I know it's really helpful to see it in action, but sometimes just seeing a still shot, clear diagrams might help. So hopefully this helps make sense. On your rulers, I love having horizontal and vertical reference lines, which you can kind of see here on this illustration, and then even a diagonal reference line. I like a 45-degree angle, but at least 1 or 2 diagonal lines because not all the lines you're quilting will necessarily be horizontal or vertical. So sometimes your rulers might have additional reference lines. So this is the SID ruler, and it has those kind of extensions coming out the side. What those do is give me reference lines on the other side of the foot. We'll see what these mean here in just a little bit, but just know that they're just there with additional reference lines for you. Okay, so you can kind of see here. Now, throughout these illustrations, where that circle and that crosshair is, that's kind of resembling the quilting foot, and where those lines come together in the center is where the needle would go down. One thing we have to remember is there is about a 1/4 inch in between the needle and the edge of the foot. So even if a ruler looks a particular way, it might quilt a design that looks slightly different because of that spacing there. Okay, so here we're going to kind of walk through step by step. I had some fun making these illustrations, so I hope it's helpful. So there's our quilting foot. Anywhere you see that, that's representing the foot of our machine. Okay, so long arm sewing machine doesn't matter. That's what we're kind of looking at there. What I'm going to do is, if I'm going to echo the side of an area, I'm going to use the ruler and those reference lines as a guide to help space them out. So you can kind of see here kind of what that would look like, but let's go through it step by step. So if I'm quilting along and I want a 1/4 inch spacing, I want my echo lines to be nice and close, I can put the ruler on the previously quilted line. So here we can see there's 2 quilted lines. The ruler is lined up on the first one, and then the stitching is going down the side. So that's giving me that 1/4 inch spacing. Now, this is roughly a 1/4 inch. It really depends on the spacing, but roughly about that much. So if I want 1/4 inch or so, I'm going to put the ruler on the previously quilted line or the edge of the area. So basically using my quilting to help quilt those lines and measure them out. And here you can kind of see the reference lines lined up. Now, if I want further apart, right, don't want it quilted to death like that, I want more space. Let's say I want a 1/2 inch spaced echo lines. I can align that first reference line on the ruler, and that's where the arrow is pointing at. I can align that on the quilted line. So now I have a 1/4 inch on the ruler, a little extra, and a 1/4 inch between the needle and the foot, and that's going to equal a 1/2 inch. That little bit there, it took me a second to kind of wrap my mind around, right? Like, how do I get 1/2 inch with 1/4 inch marking? But that's kind of why we add those two together. So again, I'm using the previously quilted line, I'm just lining it up with a different reference line. And here you can see the spacing there. It's funny, when I'm marking up my rulers or designing them, this is basically how I kind of think through the designs. It helps me kind of see it in a more abstract way or concrete way. Depending on the reference lines, depending on your ruler, you might have several, you might just have a couple. You can see here there's a reference line down the center of Slim that gives me about 1 inch spacing. But we're not just going to use the vertical reference lines, we're also going to use the horizontal reference lines to make sure that ruler is straight. So you can see those horizontal lines on the side. I want my lines to be straight to the area, even if that area isn't perfectly straight. I don't know if that makes any sense, but let's say my quilt, I'm on a sewing machine, and my quilt is tweaked one particular way. I still want my lines to be straight on that area. So using the horizontal reference lines, lining it up with the edge of your area, if possible, just helps ensure that that ruler is going the right direction, especially as we start building out those lines, because it's a normal tendency. Like maybe your line just tends to lean a little bit. Next thing you know, you've got a diagonal line. So be sure to use those horizontal lines as well to help you keep those reference on there. And you can kind of see the different spacing there. So again, I'm using the reference lines to line up with the previously quilted line or the edge of the area, and then remembering I have that extra 1/4 inch in between the needle and the edge of the foot. Now, if I'm quilting a horizontal line, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to align, now it's going to be a horizontal reference line because my ruler's on the side, with the edge of the area, using the vertical ones there to line as well. So again, using those reference lines to make it nice and straight. Now, I'm going to pause because for those of you that are really particular about your quilting, you can fussy this a lot. I'm just getting it kind of close, right? Like I'm not going to like get out the square and make sure that's perfect, but I'm like just using it as a reference, making sure it's somewhat on the right route and then going for it. So again, just making sure that quilting line is square to the area. Now, I can also use those side reference lines to space out my echo lines. So in between each of these echo lines, I'm traveling along the edge of the area, and so this will kind of help me see how far I need to go. So not just keeping it straight to the area, it's helping you space those out as well. Your ruler might be different. Those horizontal reference lines are about a 1/2 inch apart on the Slim ruler, and so that's kind of what you could use that for. And you can see here, then I can travel up the edge and then turn the ruler and do the same thing. So we can see continuing on. Now, sometimes though, I'm not always going to have the previously quilted line or edge of the area to align it up. In this particular example before, if I'm going left to right, I like to quilt with the ruler in my left hand, so it just kind of skims along. But if I'm going the opposite direction, which is illustrated here, I have my stitch line, I'm working my way this opposite way, I don't have anything to line it up with because there's no quilting on that side of the foot. And that's where I'm going to use those horizontal reference lines again to make sure that it's even and where it needs to be. So here you can see I'm aligning that horizontal line and then quilting along. So even if you don't have, the previous quilting to work with, that's how those reference lines are going to help you keep it fairly straight. Now, if you are confused right now because I'm saying horizontal and vertical way too much, just know I can use both sets of reference lines no matter which direction I'm quilting my echo lines. Now, sometimes if your ruler has an extension, now this is where we're going to see that SID extension that we were talking about. Those extensions give us reference lines on the other side of the foot. So here we can see, even though I don't have reference lines on the left to line up, I can use that extension and line them up there. And so you can kind of see with the illustrations. So depending on the ruler, you might have a little bit more capability there. But again, I'm still using the reference lines to make sure that it's somewhat, straight to that area and then moving on, quilting along it. So here you can see I would arrange it or position it, quilt until I hit the edge, shift the ruler, and then continue on. So that's just going to help me get those nice lines there. And here you can see, even if I'm at the bottom, I can use both sides to line up with that previous quilting. So don't be afraid to use that to help you keep it straight. Now, what if your previously quilted lines aren't perfectly straight? Well, congratulations, you're completely normal. I mean, the truth of the matter is, they're not always going to be perfect. I'm just going to try to split the difference. I'm just going to try to even it out and make it as close as I can. I promise that even if you're looking at it and each line is like, oh, that's not right, once you step back, you're not going to see if it's off a little bit. So try not to worry too much. Just use those reference lines to help you out. And even if you're going top down, again, I might not have a previously quilted line to use as a reference guide, so I'm going to use the edge of the area and then those other direction lines to help me line it up. So the first couple times it might take a little bit as you're shifting that ruler around and trying to get comfortable with that, but I promise the more you work with it, the easier it gets. And you'll be able to quickly quilt these straight edge lines that are somewhat evenly spaced without doing a lot of marking. Now, what about the diagonal reference line? I love that because sometimes I like to quilt 45-degree lines. And so using that diagonal reference line helps me keep it at that right angle. So you can see here, the slim ruler has 2 diagonal ones. Depending on the ruler, I know like Handy Quilter's straight edge ruler also has 45 degrees, but it could be 60. It depends. And so what I'm going to do to use that diagonal reference line is that gets lined up along the edge of the area. So in this example, I'm pretending I want to quilt a triangle. So I already have my foot in position. I'm going to position my ruler and have that diagonal reference line lined up on the bottom of the area, which you can kind of see right there. That's going to show that, okay, once now I quilt along, it's going to be 45 degrees to that bottom edge. I feel like I sound like a ruler geek here, like I'm just kind of geeking out, but it's so cool how you could do that. Sometimes the area might be too big, or maybe you can't quite get that diagonal reference line on the edge of the area. In that example, like here, I'm just looking to make sure that that diagonal line is parallel to the edge of the area. I can tell pretty easily if it's not. As long as it's somewhat parallel, then I can move along. And so quilting along that. And then when it's time to turn direction, go the opposite way, I'm going to rotate the ruler and use the diagonal reference line that's going the opposite direction. So you can kind of see here. I love doing this for border designs. To be able to quickly kind of quilt some zigzags and then fill them in is a lot of fun. So here you can see that right there. Now, if you have a ruler and you need a specific line and it's not on your ruler, that's definitely going to happen. Every quilt we come across is going to be slightly different. In that example, I like to use glow line tape to create temporary reference lines. So in this example, if I wanted to quilt my next angle so that it's whatever degree this angle is, I can put a piece of tape right there on the ruler and use that as my reference line. Then when I'm done with the quilt, just take it off and then move on. It's a really great way to make it even quicker when you're quilting that. I can't think of a specific example, but I know like if I've worked on a quilt for Tula and it's like a 60-degree block, or I want to quilt some ghost blocks and I want to go a certain angle, it just kind of gives me a quick reference line to work with. So here you can see just using that as a guide to quilt my next line. You don't have to use a lot, right? I just need a little bit of a reference line. So here I added another one, and so I could have both directions. And if this were an example of an actual quilt, once I got done with the quilt, I would just take that tape off and be good to go. Now, one thing we're not going to really get into in this live chat, but if I'm bringing my quilting to come to a point, like I want that diagonal line to end at that specific point, I have to remember that there's about 1/4 inch in between the needle and the edge of the foot. So that's why my ruler is offset a little bit at that bottom. If I put that ruler right on that point where that quilting is, my quilting is going to actually end up 1/4 inch away. So just one of those things to kind of wrap through your mind. But again, if you have extension lines, that will show you where the stitching line will be. So in this example, for the SID ruler, the very first reference line that's on the other side of that straight edge is my stitching line. That's going to show me where my stitching is going to end up, and that allows me to position the ruler as necessary. So again, using those reference lines, if you have them, to line those lines up. And then when you're done, you have some beautiful cross-hatching. Again, I don't love doing large amounts of cross-hatching, but that's definitely fun to combine it with swirls. So I know that's kind of a lot to hit with the reference lines, but as you're quilting and as you're going, if you can use those reference lines, it will help you quickly kind of like work through that. There's nothing wrong with marking out, let's say, all your echo lines, but that can be really tedious and it's just not very fun. And if the quilting comes off of it, then you're just mad, or I'm just mad. So just a quick way to quilt those straight lines without having to mark or do a whole lot of measuring. So again, look at the rulers you have, look at those reference lines and see how you can use them to keep it nice and straight. So I know I kind of threw the straight edge quilting on you, but I think there might be some questions with that. In next week's live chat, I'm going to talk about wavy rulers. So how do we use those to create all over waves? Again, it's really fun to kind of dive in to each type of ruler and see different ways to use it. If you've been kind of interested or you're kind of like, ooh, I think I might want to try this, one thing I love to suggest to my machine quilters is to get a piece of fabric, a solid piece of fabric, a yard or so, load it on your machine or make a quilt sandwich and get a ruler and try to use it in a lot of different ways. Try rotating it, try overlapping it. We'll see some examples of that next week. That will let you see kind of what you can do with your ruler. Then, when you're done, cut out the sections of quilting that you like and keep it kind of as your sample book there. So I like to joke in my ruler classes, my samples are all pretty small because I've cut them out of bigger quilting that maybe didn't look so good. All right, so questions about straight edge rulers. Again, if you want to check out the video series, you click in the link description box below. I think it's a lot of fun. All right, when I'm quilting a large quilt on the long arm, how do I baste along the edges? So on a long arm, as I work my way down the quilt, I'm going like in sections like this. So as I advance the quilt and I have my next quiltable section, that's when I'll stitch along the side, just as far as I can reach. I'll quilt in between them and then advance. So I'm basting the sides kind of as I advance down the quilt, if that makes sense. I know there have been long arm questions. I think I'll do a live chat eventually on long arm quilting, but that's how I'm approaching it. And you didn't ask this question, but I'll answer it for you. The thing about quilting on a long arm is I don't want to leave any big areas unquilted or unstabilized. So as I'm working my way down the quilt, if I have to leave a portion of that unquilted, I'm going to stabilize that with some straight pins or some basting stitches to help hold it in place. Because as I work my way through the quilt and come back, it could shift. And so just as a little thing. Do I break thread on the side edges and then go back to where I left off? So I'm assuming this is still the stitching along the side. Yes, so not to get too deep into it, I will stitch along one side. Let's say go back. I've advanced my quilt. I have my quiltable area. I will stitch down one side. I'll actually hold the other side down with some corsage pins. So I'm stabilizing it. It's held in place. Then I'll start quilting from here, and once I get to that edge, I'll take those pins out and stitch it down. Or I could break thread and do the same. The reason we have to do that is on a long arm, we haven't stabilize that quilt sandwich at all. So as I work my way down the quilt, I need to stitch down the sides so I don't suck it in. That's not required on a sit-down machine because I've already made my quilt sandwich and I already have those layers stabilized, so I can go wherever I want. But in this example, I'm stabilizing sides as I work my way down. If you have a Pro Stitcher or a computerized quilting component, you're definitely going to stitch both sides down. No pins over there for that. So that means you'll break thread and move around. It's totally fine, just as long as those sides are stitched down before you start quilting. I had trouble with the ruler slipping as I moved the fabric. I put anti-slip strips on the ruler, which helped, but I can only use the front side of the ruler. Any tips? Okay, so 100%. When you're learning how to use the ruler, it's really hard to kind of keep it in place. You're learning how to hold it and how to move that whole quilt through. The best advice I can give is it will come with practice. And then also try to be a little higher up so I can push down. I want to push down on the quilt and then over. It's not just over. So pushing that down kind of helps hold it in place and then move on. But I have noticed, like when I'm quilting on a sewing machine, if I'm in the center of the quilt and it's exceptionally heavy, sometimes it's really hard to push or get started. And in that case, I'm just kind of doing the smush and push and just trying to get through it. But if the ruler keeps slipping, that's something that will work itself out with practice, especially if you have a little bit of height on you. I don't want to sit so low that I'm kind of, I like to say, T-Rexing it, like I look like a T-Rex, because I want to use that gravity to my benefit there. So that really helps. And as you start quilting with rulers, if you start working with the wavy rulers or the clamshell rulers, we're going to see where slipping can really kind of be a problem. But the more you work with it, like I said, the easier it gets. Another thing is you can try different positions depending on your machine. You might have an easier time working on the right side of your foot, putting that ruler in your right hand. So sometimes, watching other people, you might be like, oh, that's not really working for me. You can try different hand positions and see if that helps. Lastly, like if you can only quilt, like you're like, I can only quilt from the front of the ruler, I can only go horizontal, then just lean into it. Rotate the quilt when necessary so that you're still quilting them in the way you want to, direction you want to go, but in the way that feels more comfortable. So hopefully that helps. And also I will say, if I'm quilting on a sewing machine, maybe a little bit shorter rulers a little bit easier, because I don't want that big old ruler on the front or the back getting in the way. So hopefully that helps. Again, machine quilting with rulers is a lot of fun, and so through the next couple of weeks we'll just kind of highlight the different ones. Like I said, I'll be talking about wavy rulers next week, and then we'll talk about curves and different points. So if you want to check out the video series, you can definitely do that. The link is in the description box, or of course you can check out my YouTube channel. I hope that you all have a great week. Hope that everybody stays healthy and safe, and I will see you next Thursday at 3 p.m. for the next live chat. Until then, everybody, happy quilting.